designers, including 3 former clerks. So we know town and parish councils very well, and we know planning from the town and parish council perspective extremely well as well. You may know us from our work in neighbourhood planning, where we've supported more than 200 projects across 60 local planning authority areas. We also work with local communities on local plan and major planning application reps, settlement spatial plans, design codes, asset reviews, and forward planning services. Basically, if it's planning related, feel free to contact us and we'll see if we can help. Our contact details are in the slide pack there. So if you want to get in touch after the session, please do. At today's session, we're going to look at an overview of the proposed new NPPF and give advice about how town and parish councils can prepare for its adoption. Due to the limited time we've got today, we won't go through the whole NPPF paragraph by paragraph, but we have made notes on the slides of the paragraph numbers that we're referring to as we go along through the key elements. And you can use those to structure your consultation response if you're planning on making one, or if you want to refer to a particular paragraph and what that means. Just housekeeping before we go, please stay muted and your cameras off through the event to ensure everyone can hear and see clearly. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the event. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll aim to cover as many of those as we can before our time is up. After the event, we'll send out a copy of the slides and a video of this session. Please do feel free to share these with your colleagues. And I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker. This is Matt Jennings. He's a planning and development consultant. Matt works across a wide range of projects for town and parish councils, including neighbourhood plans, design codes, and planning application reps. After recently completing his postgraduate study, Matt is currently working towards his RTPI chartership.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Louise, would you mind going on to the next slide? Thank you very much. So as I'm sure you'll all be aware, the new National Planning Policy Framework is currently out for consultation, which ends on the 10th of March. And a revised version of this document will be adopted once the consultation responses have been reviewed. There hasn't been any indication from the government about when the final version will be adopted, but based on previous consultations, we anticipate it will be in the summertime. As this is the only opportunity to influence the final version that will be adopted, it's important to engage with this consultation, particularly if there are proposals that you disagree with or you think there are aspects which are currently unclear and could cause uncertainty at the decision-making or appeal stage. The new NPPF represents a major reset in national planning policy with a number of fundamental changes and additions. There's been a strong drive from central government to accelerate the speed at which local plans are brought forward to increase plan-led housing growth. This may be facilitated by shifting the responsibility for development management policies from local plans and neighbourhood plans back to the NPPF. In revising the content of the framework, there's been a significant overhaul to the structure of the document, which will take some time to get used to. Those of you who have experience in reviewing and responding to planning applications will be familiar with the old numbered system, i.e. paragraph 1, 2, 2, 4, 3. This has now been replaced by a new structure which stitches the old continuous numbering and includes individual numbering based on each policy theme, for example, F1, F2, F3 for flood risk policies, and GB1, GB2, GB3 for greenbelt policies. This should make it easier when referring to policy numbers in planning applications and appeals. It also means we won't need to relearn all the policy numbers when the government next decides to tweak the document. Another clear structural change is the greater distinction that's been made between plan-making and decision-making policies at the start of the framework. Most of the other thematic policy sections are similarly named to the previous version of the framework, for example, achieving well-designed places, promoting sustainable transport, etc., but some of them are now in a different order. There are some new sections on securing clean energy and water and pollution, public protection and security. And the previous section on meeting the challenge of climate change, flooding and coastal change has now been split into two. Why has the structure been changed so much? Well, the government set it so that policies are clearer, more rules focused and more directive of where development can and should occur. The question of whether the new framework will be more rules-based in reality will have to be answered by planning barristers and through the decision-making and appeal process. Thanks.
Sorry, Lou, you're on mute.
The classic, have to do it. Okay, next, thank you very much, Matt. Next, we have our Planning and Development Manager, Leah Coney. Leah manages a portfolio of Town and Parish Council clients for ONH with a focus on town centre regeneration, asset management, redevelopment, and place marking. Leah also has over 18 years' experience of working in local government and significant hands-on experience in the practical day-to-day management and deployment of public-facing projects, working as a liaison between the local community and key stakeholders.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I will be focusing on plan making, which is covered in Chapter 2 of the draft, as well as selected policies relevant to local and particular neighbourhood plan making, covered in Chapter 4, which is titled Achieving Sustainable Development. As Matt has explained, this iteration of the NPPF is indeed a weighty tome, so in considering these chapters I will concentrate on what I believe to be the key issues from a town and parish council perspective. Despite the sheer size of the document, there is a very strong message when it comes to plan making. Each of the constituent parts of the development plan are to have a clear and distinct role with no unnecessary overlap. So, and apologies to anyone who has not watched the BBC sitcom W1A, although if you haven't, you really should. This draft of the NPPF is a bit like the fictional BBC mission statement, putting what we do best front and centre and identifying better ways of doing less of it more. In short, plans should be tightly focused, should not duplicate other plans, and should only address matters that are necessary and relevant. Next slide, please. So in overview, the development plan comprises of the spatial development strategy, local plan, minerals and waste plan, any supplementary plans, neighbourhood plans, and finally the policies map. Each part of the development plan is set out in policies PM1 through to PM5 of the draft. So firstly, spatial development strategies, or SDSs, covered in policy PM1. This is a new part of the development plan, or Back to the Future if you were around when regional spatial strategies were in place before their abolition under the Localism Act. Introduced via the Planning and Infrastructure Act, these will be prepared over the next couple of years and will cover a period of at least 20 years. We're currently awaiting the geography of these, but they are likely to align with the combined authority locations. Policy PM1 sets out their role, including broad locations for new settlements, major urban extensions, reviewing greenbelt, supporting economic development, and broad locations for nature conservation and strategic infrastructure. In some cases, there may therefore be value for the largest town councils, or indeed clusters of town and parish councils, to be paying special attention to them. I'm not going to spend time today on minerals and waste plans or supplementary plans. However, we think that supplementary plans, which may in effect be site allocating neighbourhood plans, but led by the local authority, may provide a way for town councils to work collaboratively to plan for site allocations, particularly where there isn't a neighbourhood plan in play. I'm going to focus today on local plans and neighbourhood plans, but a few words on the policies map. The clear intention is that everything will be in one easy-to-use interactive location. For those of you working on neighbourhood plans with us, this would be straightforward and means just exporting the shapefiles of your policies map across to the LPA to upload. It also means that in future, if we're all using the same digital mapping, we don't have to read your existing designations, which will be an all-round efficiency, which we welcome. Next slide, please. So on to local plans. Policy PM2 details the 4 purposes of the local plan. These are 1, to have a vision for the area supported by no more than 10 measurable outcomes. 2, to focus on land for development for at least the next 15 years. 3, to identify contributions expected from that development to meet affordable housing and on and off-site infrastructure. And fourthly, other policies, but only where these support the delivery of specific allocated sites. So this is to set clear expectations of what is required from them in terms of layout, infrastructure and design, or other policies where these address particular local issues. So effectively doing more of less. Policy PM2(2) sets out that plans should be prepared under the new 30-month local plan timetable. This reform to the plan making system was introduced via the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, and we will prepare a blog for clients on this in due course. But the key takeaway for you today is that you need to be aware what timetable your LPA plan is working to. For some, this new process must commence in June this year, and for those of you looking to influence or shape growth in your parishes or use neighbourhood plans to make site allocations, there is going to be a limited window for having dialogue with the LPA to confirm this, so that you both have a clear understanding and agreement over the delivery vehicle for development in your area so you don't duplicate. You are therefore going to need to prepare over the coming months to understand how to engage and respond. For those of you in areas where the LPA is aiming for the local plan to be submitted under the current system, with the December 2026 deadline, you have probably already responded to or are about to respond to a Regulation 18 and will be preparing your response to the subsequent Regulation 19 over the coming 6 months. Annex A of the new draft indicates that once the NPPF comes into force, development plan policies which are in any way inconsistent with the national decision-making policies in this framework should be given very limited weight, except where they've been examined and adopted against this new framework. This means that any local or indeed neighbourhood plans being submitted for examination in the latter part of this year, although potentially examined under the current NPPF, should be consistent with the new NPPF if they're to have weight after adoption. So if you're drafting your neighbourhood plan policies now, make them new NPPF friendly. And if you are preparing local plan responses to consultations, you should be a critical friend to the LPA, identifying where policies may not comply with the new national decision-making policies, as well as commenting upon the spatial strategy, sites and other parts of the draft. Next slide, please. So let's focus on neighbourhood plans. The naysayers were wrong. They are still with us. I did have a quip about it having a longer shelf life than the standards board, but anyway. The 2024 NPPF says that neighbourhood plans can shape, direct and help to deliver sustainable development, but should not promote less development than set out in the strategic policies for the area. The 2025 draft explains that neighbourhood plans should allow communities to plan positively for their areas by identifying and addressing community priorities that can be met or supported through the planning system. They should do this by A, allocating land to meet the development needs of their designated area where appropriate to do so, and B, set out policies which address particular local issues. These should relate to site-specific matters, or where appropriate may cover wider issues such as the provision of infrastructure and community facilities, regeneration opportunities, design requirements, including design codes, local environmental improvements, and the conservation of local heritage assets. As before, neighbourhood plans should not be promoting less development than provided for in other parts of the development plan. The ONH view on this is that the wording is sharper and focused. The expectation of neighbourhood plans in this draft are framed more proactively. This reflects what our neighbourhood plan clients have known and have been doing for years, but in particular over the last couple of years with the paucity of local plan coverage, which is stepping up and meeting their development needs in full to engage Para 14 and introduce prematurity as a material consideration in the planning balance. Liani will be covering the presumption in favour of sustainable development in her presentation, but I would like to discuss draft policy S6 as it is specifically about neighbourhood plans. Next slide, please. So, policy S6 retains the wording of the current NPPF Para 14, but there is now a subtle difference. Para 14 states, in situations where the presumption applies to applications involving the provision of housing, then the adverse impact of allowing development conflicting with a neighbourhood plan is likely to be significant and demonstrably outweighed by the benefits, provided the following applies. A, neighbourhood plan became part of the development plan 5 years ago or less. before the date on which the decision is made. And B, the neighbourhood plan contains policies and allocations to meet its identified housing requirement. Draft Policy S6 uses the same wording for A and B, but the first sentence has been changed to remove the presumption. It now states for development proposals involving the provision of housing, the benefits of approving development are likely to be substantially outweighed by the adverse effects where a proposal would conflict with a neighbourhood plan. So what does this mean in practice? As we know, Para 14 is a policy to rebut the presumption in favour of sustainable development, i.e. when the tilted balance is engaged, where the local plan is either out of date, there's no 5-year housing land supply, or poor housing delivery test. Neighbourhood plans allocating sites to meet their identified need currently use Para 14 to level that tilted balance, so it's an explicitly defensive policy. For those of you that remember back to the 2012 version of the NPPF, this is more or less taking us back now to the original Para 198. Policy S6 is now proposed as a national decision-making policy and arguably has greater functional weight as it's now a standalone policy. It does not need the presumption to be engaged first. In my view, this gives neighbourhood plans clearer, more formal weight-bearing application because the policy either is engaged or it isn't. Next slide, please. This slide just shows the comparisons between the two, and I would just conclude in saying that this feels more like the 2012 version of the NPPF in positively positioning neighbourhood plans. Next slide, please. Finally, my top 5 other neighbourhood plan highlights from this draft. Firstly, Policy PM13. This directs the limited quantitative standards which can be set through plans, which should be limited to infrastructure provision, affordable housing requirements, housing mix and tenure on sites of over 150 units, parking and design, and placemaking, where these provide clarity and a high degree of certainty about the requirements that the relevant development proposals are expected to meet. Such standards should be justified, drawing upon relevant evidence of local characteristic and need, whilst utilising or adapting relevant national standards where it is appropriate to do so, such as in relation to green infrastructure. And B, should not cover matters which are already addressed by building regulations other than in relation to accessibility standards, for which local standards in relation to requirements M42 and M43, so those are the accessible and adaptable dwellings, or wheelchair user dwellings for M43 of building regs are permissible. And this is already done in a number of our local, in our neighbourhood plans. Secondly, you can set a standard in relation to water efficiency, where it may be appropriate to apply a the tighter building regulations optional requirements where justified, or exceptionally a more stringent local standard in areas of serious water stress. As with local plans, neighbourhood plans should not be duplicating, substantively restating or modifying any of the national decision-making policies in this draft. Number 2, policy GB4, which is defining greenbelt boundaries. As we know, changes to greenbelt boundaries are only undertaken following a review, usually as part of the local plan making process. The current NPPF is clear in Para 145 that where a need for changes to greenbelt boundaries has been established through strategic policies, detailed amendments to those boundaries may be made through non-strategic policies, including neighbourhood plans. However, in the draft version, footnote 48 of GB4 sets out that such a boundary change can be made through a neighbourhood plan where the need for changes to greenbelt boundaries has been established but not yet made in local plans, in which case detailed amendments to those boundaries may be made through the neighbourhood plan. So there is no requirement for a strategic policy in a local plan to be in place as the hook for a neighbourhood plan to make those detailed amendments, which in recent years has been difficult with more and more neighbourhood plans coming in ahead of their relevant local plan. This draft of the NPPF therefore recognises this position and allows for neighbourhood plans to use the outputs of emerging local plan work to establish if greenbelt release is going to be required, where the most poorly performing locations are located, or as we're currently seeing, the output of greenbelt studies identifying greenbelt land. And again, Liani will cover this in more detail. Using this information to bring forward development sites in neighbourhood plans which amend the greenbelt boundary, and therefore not having to wait for the local plan to be adopted in order to do so. Thirdly, PM61E, we've still got to get used to these numbers. Whilst the PPG has always said that not all neighbourhood plans will need an SCA, Strategic Environmental Assessment, it is good to see this elevated into the NPPF itself in footnote 12, although we will see what attention LPAs pay to it. We have often argued that it is needless to require an SCA for a neighbourhood plan, which is allocating, for example, 25 homes. Number 4, PM6-1F this time, which states that plans should be published in a searchable digital format, e.g. as a text-based web page, which complies with defined data standards where applicable to ensure plans are easily navigable and accessible to different users. So for clients who already have web-based neighbourhood plans, a number of ours do, you will no longer have to prepare a PDF version at the submission stage. Finally, 5, Annex A, Para 6, sets out the transitional arrangements for neighbourhood plans, noting that the cut-off is the publication date of the final 2025 framework. So neighbourhood plan regulation 15 submissions made on or before that date will continue to be examined under the 2024 framework. Otherwise, they must comply with the new framework. This annex also explicitly allows submitted plans to be withdrawn and updated to take account of the new framework. For those of you working with us to prepare your plans, we will review your draft policies to consider whether they will functionally have weight once the new NPPF is in place, whether the timings mean that they're being examined under the current or the new one. For those of you working with other consultants or indeed preparing your neighbourhood plan yourselves, think about what this will mean for the shelf life of your plan. There is little point submitting your plan with policies which conform to the current NPPF, but may in practice be set aside the day they're made for not conforming to the new national decision-making policies in this 2025 version. You may also need to manage community expectations. If residents are voting for a plan at referendum, they should be reassured that they are meaningful. That's it from me, and I will now hand over to our Planning Director, Liani, who will take you through the development management implications of the new draft. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. So yeah, some compelling information there from Leah, certainly because within the profession there seems to be a kind of convenient ignorance of neighbourhood plans and the fact that they have survived this version of the NPPF, and not only survived, but time has been spent and thought has been put into drafting policies, new policies in terms of how they're going to operate in the new system. So for those of you who joined our last event where we discussed the previous version of the NPPF, you might recall my slide on the presumption of sustainable development being back with a force. Well, now the ministry, in their own words, is in effect applying a permanent presumption in favour of suitably located development. So what does that mean? Well, next slide, please, Lou. It essentially means that there's a range of locations where different kinds of developments are going to be acceptable in principle, unless the benefits outweigh the adverse effects. And that is the permanent presumption. So it's important to note that that doesn't apply to the Greenbelt, but there are some changes to Greenbelt policy as well, which I will talk about later. So right now we're just focusing on land outside of the Greenbelt. I think, I'm not trying to say this to scare you to think, oh, there's going to be a load of places where development can now happen where it hasn't before. I think it's really, really important to remember what Leah said there. Having an up-to-date development plan still matters. But I just want to take you through where some types of developments will be appropriate according to national decision-making policy, just to better inform you. I think the key for you to remember is that there is still something that you can do to deliver better outcomes. But what it does do, sorry, previous slide still, Lou, is that it comes with a clear signal that opposing growth at all costs is probably not going to serve your communities well. But opposing the wrong growth in the wrong location absolutely will still serve you well. So really, in my opinion, I think what town and parish councils need to do to ensure you're in a position to respond to these kinds of developments as they're coming through the new system, once this is published, is just be ready. Just know what you want from developments or what your community would want from developments, so that when that planning application or that local plan draft allocation hits your desk, you know what you're going to say about it, and you know what you're going to try and negotiate, etc. Louise is going to tell you a bit more about how you can do that at the end. Next slide, please, Lou. So certain types of development will be appropriate as per national decision-making policies, not in the green belt, but something that they've termed within settlements. So what does within a settlement mean? Well, again, not in the green belt, but for those of you who are preparing a neighbourhood plan or involved in your local plan consultation, you might have seen something or come across something called settlement boundaries. Sometimes they're called development limits or built-up area boundaries. But of course, if you have them, it's going to be a lot easier to establish whether something is within a settlement or without a settlement. So if you are preparing a neighbourhood plan, that's something you're going to want to be thinking about. Again, this does not apply in the green belt. Those without these, in my opinion, I think it's just going to provide a lot more wiggle room. Another argument to have in the planning application sphere. But the consultation version of the NPPF does provide 3 categories where development in settlements will not be acceptable. One is about having an unacceptable impact. One is avoiding the whole or partial loss of some types of undeveloped land. And another is where there is a failure to comply with national decision-making policies, which state that proposals should be refused in certain circumstances. So they're all listed. You can go and have a look at them yourselves in National Policy S4. But in my opinion, when I read through all of them, I don't think it's a massive change in terms of the way the system's operating now. What I mean by that is it excludes land that's currently used for, sport and recreation, open spaces, local green spaces, cemeteries. So it still excludes, as in principle, development from those locations. But what is new, and which is what's in bold on my slide, is that there is now a kind of focus from national policy on intensification in settlements. So that's within national policy provisions L2 to L4. And really what that sets out is that there's a much clearer signal now on allowing this intensification. So using airspace, using residential garden land. The national policy wants to see an increase in density in settlements within certain locations. So of course, again, it's not to scare you. It does come with caveats, but it's nonetheless a clear signal what the government thinks the efficient use of land means in practice. And Lou will tell you again later about how our design codes are particularly well suited to work with this approach, that's now much more clearly advocated for by national policy. Next slide, please, Lou. So we're not talking about the green belt quite yet again. So national policy now, or the consultation version, is proposing that some kinds of development on land outside of settlements, so outside of that settlement boundary, if you have one, is also appropriate. Again, it doesn't include many surprises. You know, what you would expect to see in the countryside, it allows. So agriculture, horticulture, you know, sport and recreation. And again, the references are in there for you to go and have a look at the list. But what jumped out at me is there's a new provision proposed for limited infilling within groups of houses. So I can think of, you know, and I'm sure as listeners can, you know, lots of little groups of houses alongside roads outside of settlements. And so what the consultation version is suggesting is that there will be a presumption supporting development in those locations. So I suppose maybe it's the kickstart of generational living, or an opportunity that will be exploited depending on what your view is. The other one that jumped out at me was community right to build orders and neighbourhood development orders. Development brought forward through those outside of a settlement will be supported. It is not a hugely popular mechanism, which I think I've said to you before, but I think it's important for those to know that that support still remains in national policy for those to come forward. And then there's provision S5.1.J, and that allows for development that is well related to a settlement if it's needed to be well related to a settlement for that kind of development that's being proposed, and of a scale that can be accommodated in terms of infrastructure, whether that infrastructure is existing or proposed as part of the development. If a need for the type of development that's being proposed can be established. So if you can show a need and it's in line with the scale and the infrastructure that's available, then that there is a presumption in favour of that kind of development. So in terms of showing a need, well, we all know that for housing, that is the 5-year housing land supply and the housing delivery tests. So if those are failed, then this presumption will kick in. So just as before, you know, they'll still come into play. But I think crucially, it's important to remember that kind of hook in terms of a scale that can be accommodated in terms of infrastructure. And then if you put that together with what Leah said earlier about plan making, you know, it's not a free-for-all. There are still, you know, provisions in there to protect character and infrastructure. Next slide, please, Lou. The last provision that jumped out of me, and the reason I'm dealing with it separately, is because this does now also apply to land within the Greenbelt. So this is all across the country, a presumption in favour of development within reasonable walking distance of a railway station which provides a high level of connectivity to jobs and services. So on the screen, I've inserted a link. And if you follow the link, you'll see that map that I've shown on the slide. It's been prepared by Lichfields, and it's really only intended to give you an idea of the locations that they think meets that definition at the moment. So it's just to give you an idea. Again, there's all sorts of caveats, and I've referenced the consultation version, NPPF paragraph numbering, so that you can go and have a look yourself. So again, you know, my reminder, it's not a free-for-all. The provision has been carefully written, and in our view, it continues to allow plans to shape development looking to benefit from this national policy, particularly in terms of scale. But I think it's important for me to let you know that there has been a lot of talk within the industry about expanding that definition. So that link takes you to a blog that Lichfields wrote. and they're essentially saying that the government's missing opportunities here to meet, to fix the housing crisis, and they should expand that definition. So right now, the provision is aimed at those areas that potentially you can see on the map as meeting the definition, but watch this space. We don't know if it'll be retained or amended in the revised version of the NPPF. Next slide, please, Lou. So we're going to stick with communities in the green belt, and again, the provisions within the consultation version of the NPPF is that there's a list of types of development that's considered are not inappropriate development in the green belt. I feel that, again, there's not many new items that have been introduced since the last 2024 NPPF. We're still looking at agriculture, horticulture, limited infilling in villages, redevelopment of previously developed land. They all survive, as well as the provisions on grey belt, but of course adding the railway station criteria that we've just discussed. In terms of grey belt, the provisions remain, but those who operate within or who's come across grey belt proposals know that there is a list of criteria that developers have to show that they meet if their proposal is going to be looked upon favourably. And one of them is if the proposal lies in a sustainable location. So that criterion's slightly been amended. So it still focuses on avoiding car-dependent development, and it still cross-references to the paragraph in the NPPF about that. So on my slide, you'll see here it's provision TR 3.2. But of note is that provision TR 3.2 has been amended to publish this connectivity tool. And it's essentially saying that decision makers should use this connectivity tool to help them decide whether the development is in a sustainable location. Not solely, it's not saying just use this tool, but as part of the evidence, you can look at what this tool is saying about a place in terms of travel to services and facilities. So the link that's on the slide there takes you to a light version of this tool, which is free, but built environment professionals can request the kind of back end part of this tool. And so if you are a plan maker, if you're involved in neighbourhood planning, then I think absolutely you can request the back office end of this tool. But if you're not interested, then there's a light version you can go and have a look at. The definition of grey belt has also changed. So at the moment, there's something called footnote 7 assets, which are relevant. And the consultation version of the NPPF proposes to remove that as part of establishing whether a site is grey belt or not. So again, it's not to be concerned because there are other provisions in the NPPF about protecting these footnote 7 assets that stay there. The only thing that they're proposing is in terms of identifying whether land is grey belt or not, they're just removing that as a consideration from that particular thing. So the definition of grey belt land will only be about the 3 relevant purposes of the green belt. I wouldn't say this takes away from the protection of those footnote 7 assets. So I don't think that's too much of a massive change. The other changes on grey belt includes the ability to consider viability. So previously, viability would not have been able to be used as an excuse not to meet the golden rules to develop grey belt land, but now there are particular circumstances where it could. And again, I've included references on the slide so that you can go and have a look if it's of interest. What has not been there before is the other thing that jumped out at me, maybe not so consequential, but the existing NPPF supports transport infrastructure if it needs a grey belt a greenbelt location, the consultation version of the NPPF now also supports electricity network and water infrastructure requiring a greenbelt location. So I think it's a clear message that it doesn't want to stifle improvements needed, but of course there might be those that are dealing with specific proposals that might make them look at that provision twice. I think my main takeaway for communities in the green belt is that the grey belt proposals has really required a major shift in your thinking. And I understand it's difficult as you've barely had a chance to get used to the concept of grey belt. But it's important to educate yourselves on how to engage with new developments. Your thinking should really now be aligned, much more aligned with your colleagues that don't have green belt. So for everyone, I think the main message is to be prepared. Know what your communities want you to negotiate and lever from development before it arrives on your desk. Or, of course, better yet, make provision for it yourself in a neighbourhood plan, which will continue to carry weight in decisions. There is, of course, a raft of other changes that Lou alluded to in the beginning. They proposing to drop any reference to valued landscapes. They're giving more power to local authorities to set their own affordable housing thresholds. But we've just not got time to go through all of that. But Lou's going to take you through what you can do to prepare for this new system.
Thank you very much, Liani. So just to do a post introduction to Liani, she's ONH's planning director, and Liani Haim is a chartered planner with experience across local government and private practice. Leveraging her diverse background and professional qualifications, she guides clients nationwide to secure better planning outcomes from new development and empowers them to navigate the planning system with more confidence. So I did note we've had lots and lots of questions through the chat. I have answered a few. Leah is now answering a few. I'm sure Liani will pitch in and see if she can answer some now. So if you've put a question in there, you may have a written answer. If there is anything you were confused about, a term you didn't understand or an acronym you didn't understand, stick it in the chat as well, and we'll make sure we answer those so you know what those terms that we're using mean. As we head towards the end of our time, I'm just going to talk quickly in a very practical way about what you can do with all of this, because we've just given you a lot of information. I appreciate it's a lot. It's a very long document, and I believe there's about 200 questions in the consultation if you do want to respond to it from the NPPF. What we would recommend is that you focus your thoughts about, so if you're thinking about responding to the consultation, maybe go back through, when you've got the slide pack from us, go back through it, look at those areas where you use those areas to respond to planning applications. So do you talk about things like transport? Do you talk about things to do with the green belt? Look at the policies that are in those areas and think, will these be a problem for us? Will they work for us? Do they need small changes? And concentrate your feedback on those areas. There is a link in the slides to the consultation page on the government website. Secondly, all of these changes in local plan making mean that taking part in local plan making as well as in the NPPF mean that taking part in the local plan process is going to be more important than it's ever been before. So the new local plan system is designed to be quick, and it's designed to be quite highly focused. So there's this change to a 30-month process, and there are set opportunities for groups to engage, including town and parish councils, with that local plan process. So if you have strong view, if you are thinking that you are likely to come up in your local plan, if you think that when the local plan is deciding where development should go, they're likely to look at your village or your town, that's something that you need to be thinking about now. How are you going to engage with that process? You can think about that in a couple of different ways. One is that you absolutely have to keep an eye out for when they give their official notice to start for their new local plan. So for some people that will be from this summer. The latest is around about April next year, I think, that they can give that first notice. And that first stage you're going to need to be ready to go for, or at least have an idea of what you want to do when that notice arrives. And in terms of thinking about what you want to do, well, you have options. Of course, you have options, depending on how much you want to get involved in the process. One of the things you can think about doing is a settlement spatial plan. We do these with quite a few clients who are going through the local plan process at the moment. And it basically, when you have your local plan documents arrive, they look at the whole district or the whole county at once, and they come up with their scenarios for where development should be. So a settlement spatial plan is just about your area. It's just about your town or your village or your group of villages or settlements, depending on what your parish looks like. And it looks at what the options would be, and what the impact would be if your area grows in particular ways. And I think these are going to be particularly important for you if you have been in Greenbelt previously, because if you've been in Greenbelt, or you're still in Greenbelt now, but if you've been very heavily protected by Greenbelt before, or even perhaps by other special designations that you felt in the past have been a very strong protection from any kind of allocated development, you might find that now they aren't, and therefore it's really worth spending the time looking at it and seeing not only what the negatives might be, but also what the positive might be. If it's inevitable that you're going to get a certain number of homes, where would be practical? Where would make sense? How would having those complement your existing settlement rather than causing issues? So that's something that we can do with you, and it's something that we can do in the early local plan stage. So think about whether that would be appropriate for you. You can also think about, if you just want to know more about the local plan system, new local plan system in general, we are planning to have another seminar like this one in June. So if you think you'd be interested in coming to that, do sign up for our email newsletter list. I'll send out a link afterwards, and we'll make sure that we send out an email with the details closer to the time. So for neighbourhood planners, if you've already started work on policies, this is the time that you need to review those proposed policies, and work out if there is any sort of repetition or too much contrast with these new policies that are in the proposed NPPF. There is that transitional arrangement that exists, but you want your neighbourhood plan policies to be as effective as they can straight away, and spending some time or asking a planning consultant, somebody else or us, to look through them and see what they say is a really very good idea. For our existing clients, we will do that with you. We'll review all of your policies and make sure there aren't going to be any problems. Particularly because you want that plan when you have it made to be as effective as possible. For those of you that are quite near the end of your process or have recently made your plans, again, it's worth the time to just have a little look, and make sure that there isn't anything that makes you think, I want to immediately do another new plan. That is an option, but it's less likely that will be an issue rather than if you're working on it at the moment. You can also think about, in that process, if you're thinking about what you need to do to get ready for the new system, because you know it's going to be under the new system, in terms of the new NPPF, you need to think about having a digital neighbourhood plan website. That is recommended. It doesn't say, someone asked this question, it doesn't say you absolutely have to have a website, but it's clearly strongly recommended. And if you aren't having a website, you'll have to put some strong thought into how you're going to make your alternative fully digitally accessible under the guidelines that I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. So as well, if you're doing a design code, they can also be digital websites. In fact, it's quite common for planning authorities to use digital platforms for their local plans and for their design codes. We can do both of those for you digitally. We've been doing that for about a year now. So let us know if that's something that you're interested in. Talking about the design code specifically, a lot of the emphasis in this NPPF in terms of saying don't repeat policies that are already in local and national policy, but you can do policies that are specific about a specific site. Those are the kinds of policies that you can get really detailed about in a design code or on a character area or whole settlement approach. You can think about things like intensity, where we need to have where you know that, for example, if it's near a train station, there's going to be a higher density of buildings that might have knock-ons for parking, for example. You can have policies about those. All of that can be tied into your design code to really think through what are the practical applications if we do have development that applies with these new standards. On the other hand, if you are dealing with likely development at the moment, and I know a lot of people are dealing with speculative development, and particularly in places that haven't had it so much before, including the Green Belt, I hope that you're speaking to the developers at the moment. We always recommend that you do speak to developers and try and put forward your views for what the community would need if the application does get approved. It doesn't mean that you're agreeing with it. You can still object to that application, but it does mean you can have that conversation and make sure that anything that does need to be in there is in there. Again, have this review of the NPPF, think about it. Is there anything that you're arguing for at the moment that actually probably wouldn't be allowed by the new NPPF, in which case scrap that, think about what will be allowed. Finally, some of you might be wondering about our backgrounds today with the little robots on. ONH has been working for a year on a sort of secret project. As a company, we've been very aware of two interconnecting problems for town and parish councils at the moment. One is with the loss of locality grant funding. Most councils have less resource for their planning needs. And also that partly to save money and time, we know a lot of clerks and councillors are using commonly available AIs like ChatGPT to ask planning questions. And sometimes we know they are getting the wrong answers because open source AIs of that kind can draw in the wrong sources or make the wrong inferences. So for just over a year, we've been working with a company you may be familiar with, Cloudy IT, to create a trustworthy planning AI for their platform GovAssist. That one assistant has become three, Planning Basics, Planning Advanced, and Neighbourhood Planner. Each one is built on years of our experience as professional RTPI members and experienced planning professionals in a closed AI model that gives answers you can trust. The assistants can help answer day-to-day queries about planning legislation, help you to analyse planning applications, new local plans, and support you through creating a new neighbourhood plan. The assistants will be launching next week at the SLCC Practitioners Conference. So if you're attending the event, please do come and find me or the Cloudy IT stall. So thank you everyone very much for your time. We do have a few minutes left for questions. So let's get started. Right, so I can see some of these have been answered, so I won't go to one that's already been answered. Must an LPA inform a parish council if they're in discussion with developers? Otherwise, how can you be engaged? So David here is concerned about how they'll know when a developer might be thinking about building in their area. Liani, thank you.
No problem. No, the local authority does not have to let town or parish councils know. Unfortunately, it is a tricky game in which you position yourself as open for business, but not to the extent that it looks like you're just happy to negotiate with anyone. But no, local authorities don't have to let you know. It is done behind closed doors, unfortunately. I think also, better relationship with the local authority. I know how difficult that is, but definitely just improved relationships with developers and local authority can help, but unfortunately there's no provision to make them talk to you.
And what we do find is useful sometimes is just people who like to walk their dogs are very good at spotting someone in a field with a camera. So if you spot something like that and you know who the landowner is, get in contact and find out what's going on. Do we need to be digitally accessible for current adopted plans or just new ones? If your plan is already adopted, no, don't worry about it. It's just for new ones. References made to land in the green belt. Where does open countryside feature within this definition? What protection remains for the open countryside?
So the definition of grey belt does not include the open countryside green belt purpose. So there's 5 green belt purposes, and if you want to establish whether land is grey belt or not, only 3 of those count. So it's still important, but not in the sense of establishing whether land is grey belt or not. It will still feature in a matter to be considered because it is a green belt purpose. And any other policies in relation to the countryside in terms of decision making, but in terms of establishing whether land is grey belt, it doesn't feature.
And then there was a question about area of AONB, which is not called AONB anymore, is it? It's called
National landscape.
National landscapes, that's the phrase. Sorry. I'm not looking at the question right now, so I was trying to remember. Asking if there's any sort of lessening of that protection for people that are covered by those areas.
I don't think so. Provisions remain on the national landscape, and they're still in there. All that's being proposed is to drop that from any consideration of whether land is grey belt. But in terms of the duty to protect and enhance or conserve and enhance the national landscape, those duties remain, and the provisions within the NPPF remain. I did see a question on somebody asking what is green belt. Well, if you don't know, it probably doesn't apply to you. There are sections of greenbelt around, some of our major cities, and it was essentially established to try and protect those cities from just sprawling out into the countryside. So if you don't know what greenbelt is, it probably doesn't apply to you.
A couple of people asking about the AI tool. Yes, I'll add some information in the email that I send out after this event, probably tomorrow, but it'll be available through GovAssist, who work for Cloudy IT, who have a lot of town and parish council clients, so you might already know them. Just go. Can a combined authority instigate a greenbelt review where there is currently no greenbelt? Do we think I'm not sure if that's something that was in the NPPF.
No, there are provisions in terms of creating and amending greenbelt boundaries. I mean, I don't think it's something that's being encouraged. But there are existing provisions out there if an authority wants to do that. Town and parish councils obviously can't do it, but local authorities can look into that. But I'm not sure it's encouraged because it's a mechanism that is seen by some that has kind of stopped housing, housing growth. And so I'm not sure whether it's encouraged, but I'm not saying it's impossible.
And there are 2 questions about sort of connectivity. So what's a reasonable walking distance and how do we define a sustainable location? If there is a doctor's but no space for new patients, is that relevant or irrelevant?
I've seen lots of references to asking whether there are established, rules for exact distances or gaps between towns. But, if they're not in national policy or guidance, then they don't really exist. So we look at, the manual for streets or professional bodies that have produced standards, and we use those. And I mean, incidentally, the manual for streets says that a reasonable walking distance is 800 meters. But then there are, of course, other organisations that say, well, it depends where you're walking to. If it's to a school, it should be really close. It should be 400 meters. If it's to, a shop, 800 meters is fine. But yeah, those are elements which you can, I suppose, control through a neighbourhood plan. If you do want to do a neighbourhood plan in the green belt, those are things that you can be really clear on and set out your local position within, and say whether a location is sustainable or not. If you don't want to, well, then those are the kinds of things that's probably going to be argued at the planning application stage.
I would just add to that the active travel England assessment toolkit for sustainability for walking distances could be quite helpful. But also just to remember not to confuse sustainability with accessibility. I think we're seeing increasingly applications coming forward, for example, near railway stations, where people assume that because they are within walking distance of a railway station, it's a sustainable location. And it isn't necessarily. But yeah, I would give a shout out to the Active Travel England assessment kit, which you can download online, which is quite easy to use.
Thanks, Leah.
So we're just slightly over time. So should we do one more question and then finish? Okay. So there's a question about whether there's a requirement for LPAs to provide councils with settlement boundaries. I know there is one, someone's mentioned, and we know there is one LPA that have removed all the settlement boundaries in their most recent local plan. And also someone asking whether that's the same as the defined neighbourhood areas, which are required by the LPA when you start your neighbourhood plan project.
No, so defining neighbourhood area is obviously for plan making. So what area your plan is going to cover. The settlement boundary is a planning policy tool. And it's very much aligned with the way in which the government is heading here about a rules-based system. And it's essentially a line that is drawn normally around a settlement that says, in principle, everything inside the settlement has got the green light, and everything outside of it, well, that's countryside, more suited to countryside development. So they're also not required to do that, no, but it's certainly a tool that we've advocated for over the years because it does promote that certainty, and that certainty that the profession and the whole industry wants is something that the settlement boundary tool meets, and we certainly advocate for it. But no, they're not required. They're certainly not a requirement.
Excellent. Thank you so much for answering that. Lots of questions about whether we'll give a copy of the Q&A so that people can see the answers that we typed as well. Yes, I will find a way to do that, and I'll send that over to you as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. If you did have a specific question about your area, or you're interested in a project that you'd like to speak to us about, do get in touch. We're always happy to speak to Town and Parish Councils. And thank you to the team. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, everyone.